Hi, welcome to the new voting project. My name is Kunal, still your host. Just want to clarify, we are looking for alternative hosts and hostesses, but that's TBD. Um, no, I'm just playing. It's still going to be me. Today we're here with Sara Swann, who's a journalist at the Fulcrum. And she's a political reporter that focuses on political reform, criminal justice reform, and many of the subsequent topics that follow. Um, I'll link her bio and website in the description. Thank you so much, Sara, for being here with us today. I understand you have, like I said, a big responsibility, so we do appreciate your time for coming on the show.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Of course, anytime. So yeah, just to begin, let's get into these questions. For our viewers, I think maybe you should outline a little bit about your background. And this is a question I ask all my guests, which is, how did college prepare you for what you're doing today? Was it really a benefit, or just give me your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so my background, I'm originally from West Virginia, born and raised there. And then I went to college in New York at Syracuse University. And I think college definitely prepared me for what I'm doing now. More the college newspaper I worked for, the Daily Orange, honestly, than my classes. I majored in journalism and political science, but I spent a lot of my extracurricular time at the newspaper, working there all 4 years, reporting, editing, and such. And that really gave me the experience, I think, to really prepare me to be a journalist in the professional sense. And so, yeah, that after I graduated from Syracuse, that brought me to my first job on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, covering the local community there in Ocean City and Salisbury, covering local politics, tourism, the environment, a whole bunch of stuff. And then from there, I made my way to DC, and I've been here for the past 2 or so years, since May 2019, reporting for the Fulcrum, covering political reform. So just continuing with these issues, before the election, during the election, and now in this post-election era, reporting on reform. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, sounds fun. And just to clarify, she does not have top security clearance, although it would be kind of cool, just as an FYI. But yes, thank you so much for that. I guess my next question is going to be, why choose, the cliche question, why choose journalism, political reform? What drew you to kind of, being an activist, but also having that role of a journalist and writing and spreading awareness? Why do that of all things?
Yeah, well, I always loved to write. And so I think growing up, I was trying to look for, sort of an outlet for that. And I joined my high school newspaper first, and that's where I sort of really got into journalism and like learned about what journalism was. And then when I went to Syracuse, it sort of solidified things for me, taking classes and majoring in journalism as well as working at the Daily Orange. Really just solidified that that is what I wanted to do. I really fell in love with it. It's a challenge, but to report and to be a journalist, but it's a fun challenge to me. I think I'm really passionate about, informing people about different issues and making it like accessible and understandable, especially when it comes to politics. I think that's also what drew me to politics, is that I think sometimes politics can be really convoluted and confusing, and it doesn't have to be that way. And so as a journalist, trying to make my reporting accessible to everyone, so that we can all participate in our democracy is really what's important to me as a journalist. And so I think that's sort of like how I came to be in the work that I'm doing. As a democracy reform reporter, I'm reporting on all the people and organizations and like the movement at large to make our democracy better, for everyone. And so I think as a reporter, just reporting on the different dysfunctions in our government and how to fix them is it's really challenging, but it's really fun, and it actually like makes you feel better at the end of the day when like there's a lot of terrible things happening, but at the end of the day there's also a lot of really good people trying to make things better. So
Right. Yeah. And just to clarify, how would you define a political reform journalist?
yeah,
How would you define your job, basically?
yeah, political reform is anything, I define it as anything that you're you in like the very broad sense, a person, an organization, a movement of people are trying to make the government work better, for the people, basically. So whether it's, making voting more accessible, or if it's changing the way we vote, implementing something like ranked choice voting rather than like, just picking one candidate, or if it's reducing the influence of big money in politics, or changing the way that maps are drawn, so that legislators aren't drawing their own districts and it's more of an independent process. So it's a lot of different issues, fit under that political reform umbrella. And so I really just define it as any sort of, movement or effort to make government work better.
Right. Okay. And as a political reform journalist,
Mm-hmm.
what would you say are your core values, your principles? What do you specialize in? And why do you specialize in those fields?
Yeah, so I think at the Fulcrum, we certainly advocate, we're pro reform. We do believe that our, government is dysfunctional and it needs to be better, but we don't really, say this one method is better than the other, because there's lots of different ideas out there. And, who's to say one thing is, the silver bullet. But I think at the core of it, it's just, for me, it comes down to being like, to participating in your democracy, like voting, I think is so important. And so I think that's, probably the number one thing for me. And obviously the First Amendment is super important to me as a journalist. And yeah, so I think those would probably be at the top.
Right. And I think you had mentioned as one of your reform policies, like changing how voting is done.
Mm-hmm.
As background, the central focus of this channel is to focus on voting rights in
Mm-hmm.
And so, what would you say? Let's circle back. Let's say 2020, very interesting year, once in a century pandemic, crazy election, hyper, polarization. What would you say you learned from the 2020 election? Starting from federal, state, municipal. I participated in all of them. So wherever you found your niche, give me your 2 cents.
Yeah, well, I think the 2020 election was a big learning experience for a lot of people in a lot of different ways. As a journalist, I think the biggest takeaway for me was thinking about reporting and being more intentional and clear about reporting. I think there was a lot of misinformation and disinformation that came out of the 2020 election, and I think that it's still happening. It's still an ongoing issue, mis and disinformation. And so thinking about smart ways that we can combat that as journalists is like a big thing that I think about. How can we tackle this issue, debunk, an issue without furthering the spread of the mis or disinformation? And I think it's something the journalism industry is like sort of grappling with at large right now. And so that, I think that was a big lesson. There were a lot of changes last minute and also confusing because there were new things. People were voting from home, absentee voting for the first time maybe. And so it was just all these different rules and, like deadlines also, like when I need to get my ballot in, like when will they count it? All these different rules that we hadn't really had to think about before. And so as journalists communicating all these changes is really important to be clear in that. And I don't think that we did the best job, honestly. We can always improve the way we are as journalists. So I think moving forward, just being more clear about why the voting system is the way it is, why there are changes being made and trying to combat the spread of mis and disinformation. And I think it's on the everyday person as well. I saw a lot of like well-intentioned people on social media trying to share information that wasn't always 100% correct. Maybe it was like 75% correct, but that little bit that was, not quite there could do some harm.
Right. Yeah, no. I think the real key topic here is, voter education
Mm-hmm.
at every level. People like to focus on younger folks, but I mean, for last year's election, there really should have been robust, education. Um, and how important would you say voting is? Regardless of your occupation, how significant is voting?
Yeah, I think voting's super important. I mean, it's connected to everything that, we care about. Regardless of, if you say you don't like politics, there are things that you care about, right? And you can connect that to politics and you can connect that to voting. And so I think it's super important to exercise your right to vote. Not everyone in this country, in our history, in the history of our country, had that right to vote. And so I think it's important that now that if you do, to exercise it.
Right, makes sense. And I'm Gen Z, they like to call that. That's our generation. um,
Uh-huh.
16, 17 year olds, the next class of incoming voters. Should we be allowed to vote? School board elections, municipalities, why do you think, or maybe don't think, it's important that we should vote?
Yeah, you're talking about under 18, so 16,
Right.
17-year-olds.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I've certainly covered this issue before, and I believe it's only actually adopted in a handful of jurisdictions that allow 16-year-olds to vote. I think Tacoma Park, Maryland was the first place to adopt that, and that's not too far from where I live, actually. And yeah, so I think it is, certainly a way, like proponents of younger people voting would say that it is like getting young people more involved in and being civically engaged at a younger age, and that just like makes it better for when they're older voters, 18 and up, and they just like, I think studies have been done and shown that like, if you start people at a younger age voting, they're just more likely to be civically engaged like throughout their lives. And I mean, the arguments I've sort of heard against it are just that they're too young, or they're too immature to vote. And so I don't know how strong that argument is. I mean, maybe it is for some people, but I think certainly one thing that there's more agreement on is pre-registering people to vote, young people to vote. So like if you're 16, you can pre-register, and then when you're 18, it's already done for you, and you can just go to the polling place and cast your ballot. I think that's great, and it's a policy in like half the states, I believe. And so it's much more widely adopted. So if not allowing young people to vote, certainly pre-registering is an option.
Right. Yeah, I'm pre-registered, by the way.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know how familiar you are with the issues happening in Georgia right now, but we see, conservative backlash against the 2020 elections. What are your thoughts on states like Georgia that are putting voter restrictions, impeding the accessibility and ability to vote, Texas, these kinds of states? What are your thoughts? And kind of walk me through what, in the world of journalism, how important it is to cover those issues.
Yeah, I mean, it's super important to cover all the changes that are happening to state voting laws and practices in Georgia and elsewhere in the country. I think, the 2020 election really made us think differently about how we vote, and just voting in general. And so we saw a lot of different changes, a lot last minute changes, a lot of temporary changes during that election. And now in the aftermath, we're seeing states sort of evaluate what changes were made and move forward from that in good and bad ways, right? We're seeing a lot of expansions, mostly in Democratic states, or Democrat-led states, I should say. And they're building on, expansions that they already had, in the works before the 2020 election, whether that's expanding absentee voting or expanding rights to people with felony convictions. And we're seeing a lot of different states take up more of those expansions. But then we're also seeing states like Georgia that are being more restrictive with their voting laws. And I think it's just a reaction. It's a reaction of how, the two major parties sort of viewed the election, really. People who viewed it as a success during the pandemic for all of us to vote and have that large of a voter turnout during the pandemic was amazing. considering all the challenges people face.
Right.
But then a lot of people do have like election security issues, and election security concerns, I should say. And I think some of those are valid, election security concerns. And there's certainly ways. I've talked to experts about this. I've written lots of stories about this, ways to improve election security without, hindering voter access. And so I do think that it's a big, sort of divergence that we're seeing in the country, where we're seeing some states go the more restrictive route and others go the more expansive route. And then you have more purple states like Pennsylvania, for example, kind of get stuck. They haven't found that compromise yet. I'm doing a big project right now. It's ongoing, where I'm analyzing all the voting laws that have happened, voting changes that have happened since 2019. So the first installment came out last week, and I did the 5 most populous states, but I'm going to be working my way through all the other states as well. So yeah, it's a big thing that I've been thinking about. But I think maybe not misconception, but one thing people might think is that it's all just happening now, like all these changes are just happening now. But really, like in my research, I've found that a lot of these changes started before the pandemic, before 2020. But the pandemic and that election really just like sped everything up. It was like a catalyst. And so now we're seeing changes in a more rapid pace. And that's, I think, why it's more concerning and front of mind for people.
Right. Yeah. That's also, I guess you could argue, the media and how they convey information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Not a critique of what you do, but it's low-key a critique of what you do.
It's valid.
Not to knock anybody today. Positivity, guys, positivity. I guess you had touched on this when we first began speaking, the importance of the First Amendment.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say is the intersection or the impact of, journalism, politics, I guess you could argue elections, voting, political awareness? What would you say is the intersection of those topics with journalism and also protecting, the rights under the First Amendment?
Yeah, well, I think it's often said that journalists are the fourth branch of government. We're people who are there to inform, everyday people, and also to hold the government accountable for their actions. And so I think that's really where it comes into play, is that when it comes to politics, it is the journalist's job to, hold them to what they're saying, and also inform everyone about the decisions that they're making, that people in power are making for the everyday people, and to inform them of, what's going on, and do so in a way that isn't like, in the weeds, super wonky, and hard to follow. And so like everyone can understand it, even if they're not like super tapped into like Washington politics. It's like, that's what I try to do. I'm based in DC, but I try not to get in that DC bubble where, it's really easy to just get sucked into all that, but trying to make it accessible for everyone. And yeah, and like the First Amendment plays into that. Just like if we didn't have the First Amendment, journalists wouldn't be able to do their jobs, and holding people accountable.
Right. Yeah, makes sense. And I guess, how would you how would you want us as Gen Z to focus on the work you do? Not only as journalists, but in that entire umbrella, right? How do we prioritize, our thoughts, our opinions coming in as I guess the next generation, you could argue?
Yeah. Well, I'm not that much older than Gen Z. I'm technically Gen Z, like the cusp, because I'm 25. I'm in that like weird spot where it's like, am I a millennial? Am I Gen Z? I kind of get the best of both.
Okay.
I get to pick and choose whichever one, suits me that day. But I think for young people, Gen Z, young millennials, whatever, I think, first of all, like this generation just does a really great job of already engaging with politics. I think that because we're digital natives, because we're so active on social media, we already have this like connection and this like way of engaging with things that is very like impactful. And so I think it's just like continuing with that, like there's so much power in using social media to, have a movement around something, to voice your opinions on something, to really politically engage. And there's tons of organizations out there, and you can check them out on the Fulcrum, that want to engage young people. And
we're sponsored by the Fulcrum.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a discussion. We can discuss that. You know, it's definitely conversation.
But yeah, I mean, there's tons of ways to be involved. Most importantly, voting, obviously. Always going to promote that. But beyond that, there's tons of ways, to speak your voice, and obviously, political campaigns are sometimes really bad about reaching out to young people and caring about young people. It's sort of like, oh, they don't vote, why would we reach out to them? But it's like, I think by proving them wrong and going out and voting and being really engaged, it's like it can be like a really powerful voting block, and can have a really big influence on the way things are done, to just continue that engagement.
Right. And like you were talking about the Fulcrum, how can viewers and people stay updated on not only your works, but also what the Fulcrum publishes as an organization?
Yeah, so you can go on our website, thefulcrum.us, and you can sign up for our newsletter. It's daily, it's free, and you can see all the stuff that we're reporting on. You can also follow us on social media. We're on Facebook and we're on Twitter at the Fulcrum's handle on Twitter is at Fulcrum_US. You can also follow me on Twitter at Sara Swann. And
I'll link these in the description.
Yeah, put them in the bio. And yeah, that's the main ways I think you can follow us for sure.
And the Fulcrum and yourself are gonna follow me back, right?
Yes.
That's the policy. If I'm
Yeah.
recommending people to follow, you gotta follow me back at least.
Of course.
And is there anything you'd like to add before we close out?
I guess just like following on that, like ways to engage, or keep up with the Fulcrum. You can also engage with us, like send us emails, send us, DM us on Twitter. If there's like something I don't know, want to see covered, or if you have questions about something, or just curious, or just want to reach out, we're always open to hearing from readers.
Great. Yeah, no, definitely. I encourage all my viewers to reach out and do their best. But yes, thank you so much for joining us, Sara. We do appreciate it. You're actually the first journalist we've had on the channel.
Hey, look at that. Well, thank you for having me. It's been great.
Of course. And you're always welcome back on the show if you ever want to cover a specific story. We'd be happy to have you back. So thank you. And enjoy the DC life as it exists. No insurrections or anything.
No.
Do give me a heads up if you hear. Yes, thank you so much, Sara.
Thank you.
Of course. Peace out. Take care.